Hey, it's Matt O'Leary, and it's time for a review of the new album. Yeah, you heard it right. New album from Closure in Moscow. This is an Australian band and definitely one of the more surprising just new release announcements of 2023.
I feel like I'm dreaming all the time. I played out the scenes.
For any millennials out there who rocked the department store classic rock t-shirts around the year 2000 or so, but wanted something a little more intense, a little more of the times, Closure in Moscow is for you. And that was me, a 10th grader, when Closure in Moscow's first temple came knocking. Yeah, scene kids were roaming the halls, or the happy emos, and post-hardcore bands were at their peak with The Used and Hawthorne Heights and AFI and, Dance Gavin Dance and Under Oath and MCR, of course. As a pretty straight-edge kid in the midst of that scene who still loved elements of that music, I think First Temple was one of, if not my favorite albums in that general scene at the time. Bringing this technical prog element and musicality that I hadn't heard in the post-hardcore and even more extreme bands. Not just wittily guitar playing, but truly interesting song structures paid off by these big fist-pumping hooks. It had the fun vocal stylings of Circa Survive, but the musicality and the depth of The Deer Hunter. Kissing Cousins and Deluge are just all-time favorite tracks for me. It's an album that grabbed me from the beginning and just remains a golden vestige of that era where pop punk and poppy emo and post-hardcore ruled rock music. That fad in rock came and went in about 5-10 years and then gave way in the 2010s to a more retro psychedelic sound. And this band just needed to progress their whole sound. Like if they dropped the same original sound in the 2010s, it just wasn't going to land like it did in 2009. And they did so with a truly eclectic record that almost can't be classified, 2014's Pink Lemonade. Prog and blues and funk and pop and weird loungy soul. Frank Zappa-like guitar freakouts and psych and electronica and these little ambient bits. Everything was just thrown at the canvas on this record, and instead of this kaleidoscopic masterpiece, I think it, for me, turned into more of a muddled brown. I respect the adventurousness, I love this album cover, but it suffered from a lack of identity in this endless search for unique sounds. It's a very classic sound writing over songwriting example. So I was really glad to hear them settle somewhere in between on this record, between the pompous hyperactivity of Pink Lemonade and the hook-first approach of First Temple. Yeah, they're still flinging a little paint on the wall, but they're older now. They've got families, they've got wives and kids, and maybe they want to make something that those wives and kids can enjoy, can dance to. The opener Jägerbomb carries forth Christopher DeSink, the vocalist's very theatrical approach, with these very menacing whispers and these sounds like intentional buzzing amp sounds behind his low croon. The intro breaks into this cut time chorus, which is pretty cool, and then you got this funky verse and some gunshot flourishes for good measure. And there's almost like some Taylor Swift vocal arrangements on the song, like especially those little response vocals sound very similar. The phrasing of them is Swifty. Yeah, Taylor Swift references occasionally. Immediately, I like that this track has a lot of changes musically without a lot of changes sonically. And what do I mean by that? Well, the song, it goes from section to section and changes chords, changes chord progressions, changes rhythms really seamlessly, but doesn't change the instrumental palette. They're not just throwing cool sounds at you to make the song interesting. They're actually writing an interesting song. Primal Sinister is a more straight-shooting pop-punk song with some pentatonic riffing. It's really cool. If you listen close, there are 3 choruses on this song, and the first one is pretty low-key, pretty mellow, and then the second one, it's kind of off and on. It starts mellow, and then it blasts you with some sound, and then off, and then on. Then the last one is just balls to the walls, rock and roll. So in these 3 choruses, they find a way to make it different each time, to progress it each time. It's just a really cool, really subtle little touch. The song Absolute Terror Field gets weirder and more industrial with these deep, dark, distorted bass tones. Up to this point, thematically, it seems like it's coming from the perspective of someone who's disillusioned by, coming up and seeing evil and coming out of their innocence and subsequently having a bit of a mental breakdown and coming under the influence of such evil and frivolity and just running it to its bitter and empty end. Better help seems like a kind of a call for help, there must be a better way. As a theme is established on the record that all these bad things that the main character is experiencing are almost out of their control. The band says life becomes a fever dream of creature comforts and time killers in soft hell, floating further into a lake of fire. We'll get back into the concept because there's a lot more to say there, but let's get back to the music. Better Way is a bit of a throwback to the first album with this impressively high hook and these skittering pop-punk drums. I like these kind of low-key, jazzy synth parts in both this song and Absolute Terror Field. They're used kind of subtly, kind of sparingly, but it's pretty nice. Holy Rush stays in a pretty traditional rock lane with this funky verse bit that balances out the angsty post-hardcore guitars. Holy Rush is one of my favorite tracks, even if it's one of the more instantaneous and accessible. Keeper of the Lake is a great vocal track with these very catchy call and response parts, but it's not that inspiring. It doesn't really build or go anywhere. And Lock and Key and Don Juan Triumphant and Soft Hell kind of stay in this mid-tempo malaise. And again, some really nice vocal parts, but one theme I see across this record is the verses aren't all that strong. Like it's kind of a don't bore us, get to the chorus situation, which is just never how I want to feel about music. I will say that the second half of that title track, Soft Hell, does bring a little bit more excitement with those great vocal arrangements that I feel like I'm dreaming all the time. And there's some really nice synth textures and these syncopated drums as well on that track. But after that is where my enjoyment of this album just tapers off significantly with the song Fine, which is fine. I mean, there's just not much else to say there. Then the very tepid 80s drum machine driven Love Lash. It's kind of cool how the song switches from 4/4 in the verse to 6/8 in the chorus, but otherwise the whole progression of the song is pretty bland, pretty predictable. I can see someone who really vibes with synth pop in general to really like Love Lash with the 4/4 that sounds very upbeat and the 6/8 which sounds very much like this, love ballad. The closer My Dearest Kate is a bit of a head scratcher. It feels emotionally charged. The vocal, the guitar line is very raw, very vulnerable sounding, but there's not really much of a tune there, so it kind of ends more on a whimper. Here's a graph of my enjoyment of this album. It's like there are some solid moments. I think I like it more than Pink Lemonade, but it's not really in the same ballpark as First Temple. Granted, that was like a completely different band, completely different world we were living in 2009. I think the vocals are like a clear step above everything else the band is doing on this album. The first time I listened was probably the best. It was exciting, it was fun, it was flashy, and then it's just progressively with repeated listens got worse and less interesting, which is the exact opposite of what you want, especially with progressive music. As for the concept, clearly on this album, Soft Hell is a metaphor for a modern day suffering that, according to the band, is brought on by the choices that fears and trauma lead one or lead you to make. I don't really connect with this idea that suffering mostly is brought on by forces outside of your control. Certainly that's the case sometimes, but not always. And I don't think that externalizing the locus of control is really a good or productive message for people who are suffering. Although, as much as I can tell, the message from this band is, that the way out of this pit is facing your demons and being vulnerable and allowing others to support and help, which is a solid message. I'm on board. That vulnerability and that facing up, that owning up, from this metaphorical world that they're drawing from, heaven and hell. It might be called Confession. So along with the music, the concept is a little bit hit or miss for me. I think it's kind of a 6.5 album. I think it pales in comparison to the band's best work, but if you look at this as a totally new band, a new era, they're got their first album, I think it's kind of a promising start, and I just hope for more growth. And that is Soft Hell by Closure in Moscow. What did you think of this album? Did you love the band before? Are you just getting to know the band? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching.
Feel like I could make it tonight.